know about as an amazing hero, someone to emulate, someone who just stood out, especially at a dark period of history where his example, his trust in God, his unwavering dedication to God is what not only helped individuals find some direction, inspired others to do the same, and continually is that source of inspiration and hope for us. And we just want to look at this particular book and just look at really 5 simple points as we go through this example of the story of Daniel, and hopefully can be encouraged by what we find in this amazing example of a servant of God. One of the first things we find is that Daniel is distinguished. He's different. He's set apart. He is very unique. In fact, to use that actual word, he was distinguished amongst anybody else. He stood out. And one of the things we obviously see this, and perhaps it's one of the reasons why sometimes we are trying to, with a fine tooth comb over all that we're looking for. Sometimes it's hard to find individuals who are distinguished because there is a price to pay. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit because that next D we're going to look at is he was despised. That is often, unfortunately, the price that you pay to be distinguished. It is a very difficult place to be. Jealousy, hatred, animosity, second guessing, wanting to undermine everything you do. Being distinguished, being put in a place where you are striving to do the best you possibly can, just as a servant, to be the best you can possibly be, to be useful in the best possible positions. It is a place that maybe very individuals hesitate to get to that place because of the prize. But we see Daniel ascribed to be that. He is distinguished. Notice it says there in Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. We see the numbers. It says, it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. Unique, special place of honor, privilege. No doubt talented individuals are being sought out. And we find that there's 120 to appoint to find this. And over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel, notice he says, began distinguishing himself among the commissioners. 3 commissioners to oversee, and Daniel distinguished himself as the top dog of all those 3. Wow. It says this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Now, I want to point out to one thing we find here is that, yes, we realize that Daniel did have an extraordinary spirit. And we recognize that, as we talked about in our Bible class, we all vary in accordance of ability. We can't all be one of the 3 that's the commissioners. Sometimes people maybe in the 120, and that group, maybe somebody will make it to that group. That's not really the point, right? We recognize, as Paul himself realized, if we start elevating certain people because of their positions, we become carnal in that. We begin that some people are more important than others. And that's not the case, but we do recognize that God needs individuals in these positions. This is to be recognized. Not everyone can be qualified to be an elder, but God needs elders. God needs individuals that are striving to use that ability that they have, that God has blessed them with. But we also recognize that God needs servants of all kinds of varieties of abilities. And one of the things we recognize is that while, yes, Daniel did have an extraordinary spirit, it's what he did with his ability that is truly amazing. I remember there's a great scene, one of my favorite movies of all time. It's just called The Natural. It's a baseball movie, and it's about this pitcher, and he has extraordinary ability. And there's this one scene where the father noticed that his son has this ability, and he's pitching to his son, and he says, "Son, you have a gift, but it's not enough." He says, "You need to develop it." In many ways, that's really the story of that particular film, is that if we don't develop our gifts, he says, you will fail. And we see that while Daniel had an extraordinary spirit, he didn't just rest on, well, hey, I recognize God's given me this ability. I'm just going to kind of run with that as far as I can. No, we say he had, and we're going to look at another D, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. He had a discipline. He had a discipline that he utilized that served him well. What was this discipline? Notice it says in verse 3, this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to the government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation of evidence of corruption, inasmuch he was faithful. Amazing, so many times people have ability but lack this one character trait of being dedicated. Being dedicated to being loyal and consistent. Notice what it says. It says they could find no ground of accusation of evidence of corruption, in which he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Certainly, wouldn't that be amazing in a political election where all kinds of mud is flying around and everybody's trying to find some dirt to pull up and someone the other. And this one's got more dirt than the other. Usually that's what the contest used to be, who's got more dirt. who has the least amount of dirt. I find that amazing. Here's one, it says, they tried everything they could to pull out all the skeletons in Daniel's closet, to find every minute area where maybe he didn't exactly cross all the T's and dot all the I's just right. They tried to find one area where he had slipped up, where it showed that maybe he isn't as dedicated to the king. Maybe there's some self-centered selfishness there. So no, he was so loyal to his position. He was dedicated. This is what distinguished him, to be this dedicated. And he is someone worth, I believe, emulating in that. That we all have to be challenged when we read this. Can we say this about the places where we work, or the places where we volunteer, or places where we have been asked to serve, or we have been put in positions of prestige or responsibility? Well, it's very tempting to say, oh, wow, well, I've been selected. I'm noted as being trustworthy. And think, well, I have a reputation for this. And believe, well, maybe my reputation, maybe what people think about me will be enough, and I can kind of coast on that. Daniel was so meticulous in his dedication, it went beyond reputation. Because when they tried to dig beneath his reputation, they found such clean fingernails, they couldn't find a single thing to say against him. Wow. And in many ways in Scripture, we are encouraged to strive to be these kinds of people. I know it's not always easy. I know we all have a variety of things that we struggle with, issues that we're striving to overcome. But I believe one of these areas that I find amazing, because Daniel, we know what his record was in terms of a prophet, his spiritual service. The work he did as a prophet was meticulous, was dutiful, was without contempt, was just spectacular. But here's another work that's actually more secular. This is something that he's actually been called by others to do this task, to do this work, outside of his work of being a prophet. And what I find amazing, sometimes I'm very much like the same way, can say, do we ever find ourselves saying things like, well, this is a particular job. What's the big deal? After all these things are going to be over with, and after all that's going to be left standing is when we stand before God. In other words, when it's time to perform some task, some yard work, some that seemingly mundane task, maybe some mundane task at work. Maybe thinking, well, compared to all the bigger things that I have going on in my life, is it really that important that I be stellar in this performance? And there's actually a passage that Jesus encourages us to strive to have an attitude that's very similar to what Daniel had, that made him distinguished. It was that his willingness to pay attention to such detail, that he felt it his obligation to be that dutiful because he felt it mattered. In fact, turn over to Luke chapter 11, where Jesus encourages us to have this same attitude. And we're very tempted at times, too, yes, to do that. Maybe it's washing the car, some task. Maybe we're saying, well, I don't know if anybody's going to see this part. The temptation to cut corners here and there. Do we all do it? Does it really matter? We sometimes find ourselves saying that, right? Does this really matter? But notice what Jesus says in Luke chapter 16 about those seemingly insignificant things. In Luke chapter 16, notice what he says in verse 10. He says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much." So, can we agree that no wonder Daniel was as faithful to God in the spiritual heavy things, because when it came to, no matter what the issue was, he was going to do the very best job. He was going to do it with as much pursuit of excellence he possibly could. Insomuch they couldn't find one single iota in any matter, as insignificant or insignificant as it might be. They couldn't find it. Where he had cut a corner, where he didn't do the job the way the king, to his standards. It was meticulous. And I'm challenged by that. And it's worth all of us challenging ourselves. Because as we're going to see, in a world that is often short of these kinds of people, what do you suspect is going to happen when you start putting yourself saying, well, I'm willing to help, I'm willing to serve, I'm willing to do this? What do you suppose opponents are going to be doing? Trying to discredit us as much as possible. In fact, that was something that Peter encouraged us to have the same mindset over in 1 Peter. Turn to 1 Peter. Remember what Peter said about the attitude we should strive to have, knowing that we're going to have our fair share of critics. We're going to have our fair share of people opposing the spiritual work we're striving to do. And notice what he says in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior," here's the word, "excellent." Now, I admit that speaks where I live, so to speak. Because it is so tempting at times to have that mentality, in whatever task is at the end of the day, does it really matter that I strive for excellence? Remember, Jesus said, well, the person who strives for excellence in the most significant matters, surely that will carry over into the bigger things. And notice what he says. He says there's a reason we should strive for this. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. In other words, Daniel is an actually example for us in this particular passage of the type of mentality we're looking for. And again, recognize we're not going to be perfect. That's not the point of being perfect. But the attitude of striving to achieve it, pushing ourselves, thinking, can I hold myself up to a higher standard? And Daniel is encouraging to me because he seemed to possess that. And as he was distinguished, he paid a price. He was despised. There in Daniel chapter 6, we find the inevitable response of all those who no doubt coveted his position, envied his position, wondered how in the world did he get this position. And out of that, they sought to destroy his reputation, destroy his character. And so they went digging. They went looking. And they were seeking to discredit, to discourage others from having confidence in him. That's what they did. In Daniel chapter 6, notice it says there in verse 4, then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. In fact, again, notice that we looked at 1 Peter. Go back to 1 Peter and note 1 Peter chapter 4, where Peter again encourages us to realize it is worth striving to be as noble, as faithful, as dedicated in all these areas of service, even knowing it's going to bring an onslaught of evil surmisings, of attacks upon us. Notice what he says in 1 Peter chapter 4. And again, this is why it's so hard. Most people are already going up that hill. They already see the people that are all on the sidelines looking at them and look at this person striving. Who do they think they are? It happens. That's what, notice 1 Peter chapter 4. Any of us, we all should be familiar with this because this is common territory for us. We know the drill. Strive to follow the example of the Lord. Strive to help and point others to follow that way, and watch the onslaught of trying to discredit us at every given point. Notice 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1. It says, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and what they malign you. Words, you don't do this. Give me a break. Everybody does this. That's what he's... Yeah, you're not going to go along with us in this? Yeah, maybe in public. We know really what goes on. That's why it's so hard. Because we realize, even as we strive for that, we have our pitfalls, we stumble, we fall. We have a wide variety of, obviously, easy evidence for people to look to. But of course, as the Christian who thrives on the grace of God, who thrives on the mercy of God, to keep striving to instill that spirit, to keep getting up, and to keep striving for, that is so hard. Because the rest of the world strives to sort of keep this equilibrium. So don't even try to distinguish yourself. Because after all, we know nobody really does this. Daniel is an inspiration. Because they tried. They tried in those things and they couldn't. And we also will face that as well. So how do we get there? How do we have any hope of even striving to have that kind of weight in our character, in our reputation? Something that Daniel had that I also struggle with, and it's discipline. Daniel had an amazing discipline. And when we talk about discipline, we're talking about doing something all the time. Discipline is not doing it when you feel like it. That's me. I'm an emotional-driven person. If an emotion strikes me, I want to act on that, and I want to seize that. If I don't kind of feel it, it's hard for me to do it. That's where I honestly struggle with that. Daniel, to me, is a great encouragement, because when we talk discipline, this individual prayed 3 times a day at the same time, whether he felt like it or not. That's what distinguished him, is that he didn't go on feel. There were times, no doubt, when Daniel didn't feel like praying. There were probably times when Daniel prayed and thought, I don't even know if anything happened with this. There were no doubt times when Daniel went away thinking, all the things I probably could have done maybe more productive than sit down here and pray. But Daniel had learned to discipline himself, whether he felt like it, whether he wanted to. It was, this is what I do. And that's something I struggle with, because that's something also we're taught in Scripture to be disciplined. Don't neglect the discipline of the Lord. The Lord wants to discipline us. When he's talking about discipline, it's not always about just whacking us and saying, well, you messed up again. But it's training us to have this mindset of a consistency to keep at it. And that's what Daniel had. Notice his discipline. Turn to Daniel chapter 6, and we see this amazing discipline that he has in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. Again, we back up. They tried to find some reason against him. They couldn't find anything. So then they thought, aha, I know. We'll find something against his religion. It says there in verse 5, then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. And you know why they said it? Because they realized Daniel is so disciplined in government affairs, we know he must be that disciplined when it comes to his spiritual affairs. They picked up on it. Isn't that amazing? That's why they went that route. They said a guy who is this disciplined in these kinds of things, no doubt is going to be that disciplined, and we're going to find him because he's going to be so loyal. He's going to be so disciplined. He's going to do this whether he feels like it, whether he's pressured to do it or not, whether he's threatened to or not. We know he will do it, and there they orchestrate the plan. Let's make up a law. Let's get the king to make a law that says, well, for this period of time, you can only pray to certain individuals. You can't pray anybody else. And here they are slyly thinking, I know one person's going to majorly slip up because he can't stop praying. Is that amazing? We got him. They use his discipline against him. Wow. There's verse 6. Daniel chapter 6, verse 6. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document that is the injunction. Now, notice verse 10. Verse 10. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God. Notice, as he had been doing previously. Here's a key piece of information. You ever wonder when you fail in temptation? Why? Why? What is that, Paul? The good I know to do, and I don't do it. The evil thing I don't want to do. I do it? How do we overcome that? Key word, discipline. It is discipline. It is, we must strive, as Daniel learned, to find a discipline. In other words, that whether this threatens me, scares me, frightens me, allures me, no matter what the sensation, no matter what the emotion is, I have a discipline that this is what I do. That's how he did it. He had a discipline, and he kept to that discipline because he was dedicated, and that's what distinguished himself. And that's honorable. That is honorable. And we're going to find out how honorable. So honorable that God delivers him. So he has this discipline. And because of his discipline, because of his dedication, because he's despised, he's dumped. This is where, and then here's the key. Is it even worth it? That's the question. All that work, all that discipline, all that meticulous attention to detail, all overcoming the temptations, all that work, is it worth it? Many people say no, because this is where we end up. Many people find themselves just like that. Well, even when I try to do the right thing, it ends up being used against me. And it was with Daniel. Here notice it says, Daniel chapter 6, verse 14. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. And for many people, that's the end. That's all she wrote. And I would say, even if that was the end of Daniel, which we know his friend, remember what his friends said? We're going to look at his friends tonight. His friends actually said, and even if we aren't delivered, this doesn't bother us. The worth of all this discipline, of the dedication, of the devotion, is we are serving a God that is worthy of this kind of honoring because of his power, because of his eternal strength, and because of the things that he gives us that cannot be taken away in this present fleshly existence. But we know this story has a different ending than just that being the end. Of course, the king thinks it might be, he's hanging on just a hair of hope. Maybe Daniel will make it. He's so worried about it. I don't know if he's that confident, actually. He doesn't sleep awake. I don't know if you call that confidence. But there's something interesting about Daniel. Daniel doesn't seem as frazzled. Isn't that puzzling? In all this, it's the king who's more frazzled. It's not even happening to the king. He's worried about Daniel, his friend, the one who he's come to be impressed by, he's become to be influenced by. And he's worried for Daniel, so much so he can't sleep. And he's all worried about it, he's so tense about it. We understand that, right? We've been in situations like that, right? The knot in your stomach. Oh, I can't eat. I can't sleep. I can't do anything. I'm just so big. I can't do this. I can't handle this, right? We've all been there. Most of us, yes, it's a common thing. Well, the king is feeling this. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Is it worth it? Well, let's find out. Verse 19. Even after being dumped, he is delivered. In verse 19, then the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. When he come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Now, this is us mostly. Did you notice the contradiction? What was the first thing the king said? Your God will be able to deliver you. You know what that was? That was wishful thinking. That's not sure. Oh. And that wishful thinking is not based off of a discipline that has learned to depend on a God who can do anything. Here's a king who's supposed to can do anything. But he's not serving a God who can do anything. Far above what this king can do. And Daniel does not serve necessarily the king, but he serves the God who has put him in this position to be that meticulous and loyal to the king. And Daniel, here's the train-up. Here's where it's worth it. It's worth it. Because hope in the God of everlasting who can do all things gives us peace. Peace. And he had it in the jaws of the lions that were just about to devour him. And the king, notice, and this is where I have to pull time out. Like, I want so badly to be Daniel. That's who, my name is Daniel. Wouldn't that be great? And I remember as a boy, my mom would read me this story. All the stories of Daniel. And I used to think to myself, the times, oh man, yeah, just like Daniel, just like Daniel. I have to confess, probably most of the time I've been more like the king. When I prayed to God, I know you can do anything. And then here I can't sleep. Is it okay? And I know why. Because I struggle with discipline. I struggle with being meticulous in all the details. Saying, well, everything matters. Maybe that's something I need to start doing better about, because that's the lesson Jesus says is he who is faithful in this little thing will be faithful in much, and will have hope, and will have peace, and will be able to do as Daniel said. Because here's what Daniel says. And this is really his deliverance. It's not so much he's delivered physically from the lions. He is delivered from the worry. He is delivered from the anxiousness. He is literally delivered from the sense of hopelessness. That's the real prison we are in. No hope. No peace. Worried mind. And here's Daniel. Verse 21. Then Daniel spoke to the king. I love what he says first. O king, live forever. In other words, I know you're the one who's responsible for me being here. But I'm still just as loyal to you inside this den as I was outside. Something else I lack. True, genuine, consistent love. And to not be given to bitterness. Not be given to anger. Something else that comes out of these things that Daniel had. He's able to discipline his mind and his emotions to say, King, live forever. May nothing of any ill will or any harm ever be done to you. It's certainly been done to Daniel. Maybe I need to be more disciplined. Daniel says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you. O king, I have committed no crime. How can we be delivered? Well, this amazing account is actually a piece of foreshadowing. Because Daniel's not the only person who was shut into a cave, so to speak, with a stone sealed upon it and thought to be dead. Many, many, many years later, there was one who was also innocent, who was perfect, who was disciplined, was put on a cross because of envy, because of hatred, because they couldn't stand the way that he was, and they acted against him, and he was put on a cross. And an angel announced proudly to those who came looking to anoint the body, he's not here, for he is risen. That's where our hope is. We can have the same kind of centered hope, peacefulness, confidence that Daniel had. If you give yourself to the God that, yes, Daniel served, and we have been given Christ, who ultimately has delivered us from the bondage of sin. And that's where we can have our hope today. Does that sound appealing? I don't really, when we talk about the idea of, well, facing the onslaught of all the envious people, the people want to take shots at us. No, that's hard, that's difficult. Is it worth it? Whose shoes would we rather be in? It's easy to have peace when everything's going great. It's easy to feel like everything's hopeful when everything's going great. We know that's not the reality of life. The reality of life is that it is a roller coaster. It is literally a roller coaster of twists and turns and peaks and valleys. And the blessing that Paul said is that whether I'm up or I'm down, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Because we can have this amazing hope and this amazing peace, knowing that Jesus, who's died on the cross for our sins, if we respond to that amazing act of sacrificial redemption, that he did that for our sins, to take away from us the worry of our position in life, to take away all those things, so that we would follow him, that we would learn a discipline. That rather than worrying about food, clothing, and shelter, we would discipline ourselves like Daniel did with things like prayer, things like service, things like worship, adoration to the Lord, meditating on the things that are worthy of adoring. And with that, you, yes, become delivered. Delivered from an anxious life, from a life that has no security. And we want to help anyone who's with us who's never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, that you might have that same sense of peace, that you might lay aside all the burden of your sins at the feet of the Lord. If you're willing to confess that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and based on that confession, die to the things of this world, hanging on, clinging, a dependency to those things, that ultimately just leads you to sin and despair. Fill your life with hope, with peace, with a constant, rooted, abiding sense of his presence, knowing that one day you will be with him in heaven, regardless of whatever happens to you on this earth. We want you to have that. We will gladly assist you to be baptized in water for forgiveness of your sins. Won't you come to the front, and we will gladly help and assist you as you come while we stand and sing this song of encouragement. Won't you come to obey the gospel?